Tonight, you're not watching a court decide who's right. You're standing at the edge of a farm boundary where the law has gone quiet and the wind has taken over. Before you fall asleep, you'll see how Vikings could turn anger into procedure, how a Níðstöng is raised like a public document, how a horse's head becomes a compass for disgrace, and why the message is kept brief on purpose. Fewer words, fewer exits. This is a curse, yes, but it's also a kind of paperwork made of wood and breath. Hoof smell hangs in cold air, sharp and clean as frost on stone. A knife rings once against iron tool against buckle, or blade against rib, a small sound that feels like a throat being cleared before something difficult. Then the pole lifts, creaking like a mast in winter, and the night listens the way open fields do, without blinking. Somewhere far off, birds shift in the dark as if they've been asked to witness. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, perhaps the next slow creak of wood will remember you there, half awake while the shame pole is planted and the wind learns the names. Because this story doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with choosing straight grain timber and deciding exactly which way the horse's eyes should face. You might not expect a horse's head, a straight pole, and a few carefully chosen rude words to function as a kind of legal stationery, but in the Viking world, it sometimes did. Not a letter you seal with wax and send politely by messenger, but a message you plant in the ground and let the wind deliver for you, one slow, chilly syllable at a time. There's hoof smell in cold air, the clean mineral scent of frost, and that small, unmistakable sound when a knife edge taps a rib or a ring on a belt, as if the tools themselves are clearing their throats. Somewhere nearby, a pole lifts wood, creaking like a mast that has forgotten it is not at sea. In the Old North, a lot of communication is not about expressing feelings. It is about arranging consequences. A farm boundary is a line of turf and stones, yes, but it is also a line of reputation. A feud is an argument with a calendar. So when an insult becomes too sticky to wash off with a handshake when compensation, negotiations turn into that slow, stubborn silence where everyone pretends to look at something else. There is an option that is both dramatic and strangely procedural. It is called a Níðstöng, a shame pole, and it is exactly what it sounds like, a tall post planted as a public curse, except with more planning than you would expect from something that includes the word shame. The first step is not the shouting. The first step is selecting materials, which is how many human beings try to feel calm. The pole itself is chosen with the same seriousness you might choose a roof beam. Straight grain wood matters because a crooked post looks like uncertainty, and uncertainty is not the mood. Some traditions and later descriptions lean toward durable wood, something that will stand through a few bad days of weather long enough for the point to be made, long enough to be noticed by whoever is trying very hard not to notice. Bark might be stripped, not out of artistry, but so the surface can be read. A curse, it turns out, benefits from legibility. And then there is the animal piece, which is usually described as a horse's head. Not in a cinematic way, not in a cheerful way either, but in the oddly matter-of-fact way per modern societies handle animals. A horse is valuable, a horse is familiar, and a horse is a loud symbol even when it is silent. Horses in the Norse world are practical, yes, but also deeply entangled with status, travel, rituals, and poetry. So the choice carries weight. It is not necessarily about violence for its own sake. It is about using a thing everyone understands to say something everyone understands. The head becomes a sign, like an arrow on a road, except the arrow is intentionally insulting. Words come next, and the words are often carved, which is, honestly, a very patient way to be angry. Carving takes time. It forces you to slow down and pick your vocabulary. The curse in many tellings names the target an individual or household and then calls on local spirits, often the landbidder, the landlights, to withdraw their support or to turn against the offender. This is important because it shifts the insult from "I dislike you" to "the place you rely on should dislike you." It is a complaint filed not just with people, but with the landscape. When the carving happens, it can be runes, but it doesn't have to be a masterpiece. Runes are practical letters. They are also a little bit of a statement. This is not a private grumble. This is written, fixed, and meant to be seen. Sometimes the worst insult is not imaginative. It is simple and repeatable. In the Norse social imagination, certain accusations carried an especially heavy charge because they threatened the idea of honor itself. There are words in Old Norse for shame and for dishonor that are not just feelings but social conditions, like having your name quietly moved to a separate list. And while later readers sometimes focus on the spiciest categories of insult, the principle underneath is plain. To pronounce "ning" is to say someone has fallen outside the expected shape of a respectable person. It's not a duel, it's a label. Once the materials and text are set, placement becomes its own small ritual. The head is fixed to the pole, and direction matters. The muzzle points where the curse should look. It is oriented toward a farm, a fjord, a district, sometimes even, at least in literature, toward a whole country. In one famous saga scene, the pole is raised facing Norway, with the curse aimed not just at a person, but at the king and the land itself. It is a very ambitious piece of signage, the sort of sign you put up when you are not merely annoyed but committed. The head functions like a compass, except it is not asking north, it is accusing it. The physical act of raising the pole is described in some accounts with an almost comforting simplicity. You dig, you set the base. You push and brace and tamp the earth so it stands. The earth receives it with that dull, steady resistance, as if the ground is practicing being unimpressed. 3 pushes, a pause, another push, something like that. Not because 3 is magical every time, but because people like numbers when they do serious things. Numbers feel stable. They feel like rules. They make even an insult seem organized. And then, because Norse society is a place where everyone heard about it, is not a metaphor, but a literal logistics network, witnesses matter. You do not want your curse to become a rumor about whether you cursed. You want it to be a known fact that you did it, and that you did it in the right way, in the right place, at the right boundary. The night air carries voices farther, and the boundary, as a concept, carries them farther still. A neighbor might be brought along, not as a friend, but as a human notary. Someone who can later say, with sleepy accuracy, yes, the pole was raised, yes. The words were spoken, yes, the head pointed that way. No one tripped and dropped it like an embarrassing laundry pole. This is the point where the pole becomes more than an object. It becomes a statement about failed communication. In a society that has law assemblies, courts, compensation schedules, votes, public cursing is not what you do first. It is what you do when the talking has turned into grinding. When judges stall, when witnesses tangle themselves in contradictions, when the other party refuses to settle or refuses to appear, the shame pole is like moving the argument from the meeting place to the edge of the land. It says, politely and rudely at the same time, we tried the normal path, and now we are trying the path where the road has no more fences. There are limits, though, and those limits are part of why this feels almost boringly legal. A Níðstöng doesn't replace law so much as it pressures it. It forces movement. It is a lever. A person who has been publicly shamed is pushed toward a response. Settlement, apology, a formal challenge, relocation, sometimes open feud. The message is not long. It is brief on purpose. Fewer words give fewer exits. It's the ancient equivalent of an email with just "per my last message," except the email is leaning in a field, and the last message is a horse head pointing at your livelihood. Oddly, the idea of honor here is not romantic, it is operational. It affects marriage prospects, alliances, and whether someone will stand with you when you need them. So a public curse is not only spooky, it is social engineering. It invites people to take sides without ever saying, please take sides. It lets the neighborhood perform its favorite hobby, standing around looking serious while pretending not to enjoy the fact that something is happening. And then there is the way language and belief intertwine. The curse often calls on the Wambatter, the spirits tied to place, to turn away from the target or to trouble them. This is not necessarily a claim that everyone literally pictured tiny creatures in the grass doing paperwork. It is rather the idea that a person's relationship with land and community is morally structured. If you violate the peace, if you commit acts that break the social fabric, your connection to place should not remain warm and welcoming. The curse is a formal cold shoulder given cosmic vocabulary. Sometimes the carver marks names. Sometimes the carver leaves the wood bare and lets the imagination do the rest. In a small community, you do not actually need a full biography carved into oak. People already know who is being referenced. They know what happened. They have already rehearsed it while stirring porridge. The runes, then, can be less about informing and more about confirming. Like writing reserved on a chair at a wedding. Everyone knows it's reserved. The sign is just there to make it official. You also see little gestures described around the ritual spitting, flinging a handful of soil, brushing sea spray, touching a knife to the pole and then to the ground. These gestures are small, which makes them feel serious. Big gestures can be mistaken for theater. Small gestures feel like habit. They feel like something people have done before and will do again, which is the quiet power of ritual. Witnesses repeat the curse in low voices, not necessarily for drama, but because repetition makes words stick. The wind learns the route. By morning, birds have investigated the thing. And the valley, which is never as prided as it pretends, has noticed too. At some point, the object is simply there. It stands. It watches. It turns the landscape into a message board. People pass it. People slow down a little. People pretend not to. Someone says softly, "Oh," the way you say "oh" when you see a neighbor's argument walking around in public. Someone else says, "Well," which is the universal word for "I will not be taking questions at this time." The shame pole does not need to chase anyone. It is patient. Its job is to exist. Now, for the onlookers in the community, the question becomes, who must hear it? In legal cultures, publicity matters. In feud cultures, publicity really matters. The curse is supposed to be known, not just by the target, but by those around them, because social pressure is the lever being pulled. At least one free neighbor as witness is not just a detail. It is the mechanism. Names might be spoken once, the act described twice, the demanded remedy repeated 3 times, because structured repetition is how you make a claim feel like a claim. It is also, frankly, how you make something sound inevitable. Humans are very persuadable by rhythms. There's also a strange kind of caution in the performance. Extra boasting is not added. No one wants the curse to look like a tantrum. A tantrum is childish. A curse is controlled. No one wants to be mocked for being too emotional because then the shame bounces back. So the voice is low, the phrases are brief, and the body language is almost calm. This is not a festival. It is a complaint engraved into the weather. And because curses are risky, you also see gestures meant to protect the cursor. People are very good at believing that words can circle back. If you announce hostility into the world, you might worry about receiving it. So you take precautions, not in flashy ways, but in domestic physical ones. Smearing ash on a door, tying animals closer, keeping children inside, not because there is a monster, but because tonight is the night you are inviting consequences to pick a direction. In a world without electric light, a boundary post at night is already unsettling. Adding a symbolic accusation makes it feel like the air itself has a job. Notice how incredibly routine it becomes when described this way. Start, speak, witness, weave. The boundary is not spectacle, it is procedure. It is one of those moments where you realize a lot of wild Viking stuff is actually people with rules doing a rule-shaped action. The action is certainly not polite, but it is structured. Even the fear, when present, is tidy. And then the next morning arrives with the ordinary stubbornness of mornings. Frost brightens the grass. Smoke rises from nearby houses as if nothing has happened. Someone still has to feed animals. Someone still has to repair a fence. And the shame pole stands there, quietly refusing to be ignored. The target might respond in a number of ways. Perhaps they send the surety someone who offers guarantees that a settlement will be honored. Perhaps they propose compensation. In Norse legal culture, compensation is not sentimental. It's calibrated. There are price lists for injuries, for insults, for deaths in some texts, as if the society is trying to turn messy human reality into arithmetic. So if a resolution is offered, it might come in measured language and measured goods. Silver has a sound when it hits a table that is almost calming, like a small apology you can weigh. If the shamed person responds acceptably, the pole can come down. It may even be buried facing away, the head turned so it no longer looks at the landed accused. That detail is surprisingly soothing. Even anger can be oriented properly, then removed. A community likes closure, but not too much closure, because closure is boring, and boredom is a resource that must be conserved for winter. If the response is not acceptable, things can harden. Elders might demand talk before winter makes knives impatient, which is a very practical way to describe seasonal psychology. Cold weather shortens tempers because everything already takes longer. Even walking across a yard is a commitment, so disputes need to be handled before the world becomes physically irritating. On the other hand, sometimes the pole simply weathers. Rain loosens rope. Ravens and other curious creatures investigate. The message fades unless renewed. Wood does what it always does. It dries, it cracks, it forgets. Even the most carefully carved insult eventually becomes material again. What undoes a shame pole, in the end, is not a dramatic moment. It is a sequence of small ones. A mediator speaks to both sides. A payment is counted and recounted because miscounting is a classic way to restart an argument. A public acknowledgement is made. A dispute is relabeled as settled in people's minds, which is an astonishing power humans have. The same event can live in the village as either the thing that is ongoing or the thing that happened, depending on how many times it is referenced over supper. Sometimes, as a final quiet step, a settlement is marked with fresh posts, plain, harmless posts, so roads forget the story. That is such a gentle idea. Replace a dramatic pole with an ordinary one. Swap a curse for a fence marker. Let the landscape return to being a landscape rather than a sentence. In time, the place becomes boring again. Travelers stop slowing down. Children stop asking careful questions. Someone new takes over a farm, and the old conflict becomes a vaguely remembered shape, like a footprint filled with rain. And because this whole subject is, at its heart, about managing speech, it's fitting to end with something like an oath for hard words. Keep facts in one jar: name, act, remedy. Keep anger in another small, tied tight, cool by morning. Say only what you can prove in daylight, because daylight has a way of making even the best insult look slightly excessive. If peace is offered, take it in steps you can walk back without shame. Let the wind carry off whatever doesn't need to be kept. Let the horse quiet in memory. Let the pole stand watch only as long as it must, and then let it become wood again, just wood. As the valley settles into its ordinary breathing, and your thoughts do the same, softer and softer, until they don't quite need sentences at all. You might not expect an entire legal system to depend on one person's lungs, a good memory, and the general willingness of everyone nearby to stand around for hours pretending they aren't cold. But in medieval Iceland, the law could arrive on the wind as a voice, not as a book. And people treated that voice with the polite attention usually reserved for weather and sheep. Imagine the sound of a cloak settling on rock, the soft scrape of boots on lava gravel, the distant patience of a river that keeps moving whether you win your case or not. Somewhere in the crowd, a small wooden cup knocks gently against a belt. Somewhere else, someone clears their throat like they're about to speak and then decides, wisely, not to. And before we begin, in the same sleepy way every night begins, I'll ask the quiet question, where and what time are you listening from? The Alhinji, the Great Assembly, is not a courtroom in the modern sense. It is more like a seasonal gathering where law, politics, trade, gossip, and the practical problem of feeding everyone all happen in the same wide open space, as if bureaucracy and camping decided to collaborate. People arrive at Lyngvellir with horses and bundles, and with that particular look that says, I have traveled a long way to be mildy annoyed in public. The valley itself does most of the decorating. Dark rock, pale water, grass that looks like it is always thinking about frost. You can almost hear the landscape saying very calmly, yes, bring your arguments here. In a place with no king on the island for much of this period, and no central executive in the way later states would imagine it, law is a shared habit. It exists because people repeat it, enforce it, and fear what happens when they don't. And so the assembly becomes the place where disputes turn from private irritation into official air. Everyone gathers with their best controlled expressions because losing your temper in a place like this is like spilling fish oil on your own shoes. The smell follows you. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The law will continue without either of us. It has done so impressively for a very long time, and it is not easily offended. At the center of the whole arrangement is a figure with an unintentionally soothing job title, the law speaker, Vilks Kumor. The name alone sounds like something you would whisper in a library while trying not to wake the shelves. The law speaker's task, in broad terms, is to know the law and to speak it aloud. Not once, not for a dramatic speech, but as a scheduled duty. In some traditional descriptions, the law is recited in full over a cycle of years, like an extremely long audiobook that no one asked for and everyone still relies on. It is law as a live performance, except the performance is mostly patience. Picture the law speaker approaching the Lagberg, the law rock, which is not an ornate dais, but simply a place to stand where people can hear you. A raised spot, a natural platform. The kind of rock that is unimpressed by human plans. The law speaker becomes, for a while, the official mouth of the island's rules. And the rules include everything from how inheritance works, to how you can prove something when there are no documents, to the very calming details of what happens if you do not show up when summoned. It turns out the past had deadlines too. They just arrived on horseback. The crowd is arranged loosely because the landscape does not do neat rows. Some people are close, some are far, some are pretending to be close while actually listening from a distance because distance feels safer. Chieftains Gogr have their groups. Clients cluster like they're sharing warmth. Travelers drift between booths. Someone is always chewing something that lasts much longer than it should, because chewing is a good way to look busy. A dog sniffs a bag and is gently told, with the seriousness of a judge, that it is not invited. Before any case can be heard, before any compensation can be weighed, the social machine needs a quiet agreement that this is the place where words become binding. That's why the setting matters. Lyngvellir is not chosen for comfort. It is chosen for visibility and tradition, and perhaps because the ground itself seems to listen. The valley is a long echo. It takes speech and keeps it for a moment, And that moment is sometimes all a legal system really needs. When you think of law, you might imagine paper. Icelandic law in this period is often more like choreography. You move through steps. You say phrases in the right order. You bring the right number of witnesses. You stand in the correct place. It is not enough to be correct. You must be correctly correct. There is a small, persistent comfort in that, like making tea the exact same way every night. Pour, steep, wait, sip, speak, witness, swear, settle. Cases do not float into the air by themselves. They are carried there, deliberately, by someone who wants an outcome. A person might be summoned. A complaint might be announced. A man might insist with absolute calm that his neighbor's sheep have been treating his hayfield like a personal buffet. And because this is a place where honor and property are tightly braided, even the sheep become part of a social argument. Imagine bringing a livestock-related grievance to the largest political gathering on the island. It is, in its own way, very committed. There are rules for how to bring a case, and the rules are part of the story even when the story is trying very hard not to be exciting. You must speak the claim clearly. You must name the people involved. You must do it at the right time. If you do it wrong, you can lose not because you are wrong, but because you said the right thing in the wrong way. This is the ancient ancestor of clicking the wrong button on a forum and being asked to start over, except the help desk is a windy valley and the forum is your memory. Witnesses matter not because the law is sentimental, but because a world without cameras needs human eyes to function as record. A witness is not just a person who saw something. A witness is part of the mechanism that turns I say into we know, and people are trained, socially, to understand that their presence can carry weight. A quiet neighbor standing nearby can be the difference between a fine and a feud. This makes everyone slightly tense, but in a low-temperature way. It is tension with mittens on. Then there is the part that sounds almost comically practical: payment. Medieval Iceland uses various forms of value, often with silver as a standard, but not necessarily neat coinage the way later economies like to imagine. Silver might come as hacked pieces, hacked silver, or as rings, or as objects that can be weighed. Payment becomes a physical experience. You hear it. You feel it. You watch someone measure it out with the careful expression of a person portioning out expensive cheese. Compensation Wergold and other fines exist because it is better, in theory, than endless bloodshed. Better for the community, better for trade, better for keeping people alive long enough to do more boring things like repair boats. The numbers can be surprisingly structured. Certain injuries have set values in some legal traditions, like a price list for human trouble. The idea is not that a life can truly be priced, but that people will behave differently if the price is known. It is a moral system operating through arithmetic, which is exactly the kind of thing that would keep you awake if it were happening to you and lull you to sleep when it is happening to someone in the year 1100. Of course, money is never just money. It is apology, insult, negotiation, and public theater, all poured into one weighed lump. Paying quickly can look like responsibility. Paying slowly can look like reluctance. Paying too eagerly can look like guilt. Humans are talented at reading too much into the speed of someone's hands. Somewhere in the background, a person is definitely whispering, "Look how he counts," as if counting reveals character. In a way, it does. The law speaker, meanwhile, continues to do the unglamorous work of being a fountain of correct phrases. Law in this period is partly written down later as the Gragas and other collections, but in the lived moment it is spoken. That means cadence matters, breath matters, a pause matters. You can imagine the law speaker pacing thoughts like you might pace your breathing when trying to fall asleep, and out steady. The crowd hears not just content, but rhythm. And rhythm is persuasive. It makes rules feel like they belong. People listening to the law being spoken are not always listening in the way you listen to a song you love. They are listening the way you listen to instructions you do not want to mess up. Half attentive, half afraid, fully aware that if you misquote something later, someone will correct you loudly and you will have to pretend you meant to be corrected. The law in public is a social performance of remembering together, and the punishment for forgetting is embarrassment, which is a very efficient punishment in small communities. And while all this sounds grand, it is underpowered in a reassuring way. There are no microphones. There are no marble columns. There is a rocky valley, a crowd, and a voice. That's it. If the wind shifts, fewer people hear. If someone coughs loudly, part of a sentence disappears. The legal system has to work in spite of normal life, not in a sealed building separate from it. A bird can interrupt a verdict. A horse can choose a dramatic moment to sneeze. The universe does not respect procedure, but people keep trying anyway. There is also the soft absurdity of how much time is spent waiting for your turn, waiting for a chieftain to arrive, waiting for someone to stop pretending they can't hear their name being called, waiting for a settlement to be negotiated with enough dignity that no one feels crushed. The wing is, among other things, an event where everyone is trapped together long enough that compromise begins to look like a warm blanket. You can hold on to anger for a while, but eventually you want to eat. Eventually you want to sleep. Eventually you want your horse to stop glaring at you as if it has opinions about your priorities. Around the formal talk, the camp life builds itself. Temporary booths here are set up, and they are not glamorous, but they are functional. People cook, people barter, people trade news in that careful way where you try to seem casual while actually gathering information. Someone sells something small that everyone needs. Someone else claims they're not selling anything and then sells it anyway. Children run between adults like little messengers with no official seal, carrying gossip, bread, and sometimes the mild chaos that proves the world is still alive. This is the part where you realize that even serious legal assemblies smell like food. Smoke, fat, bread, fish. The past is never just ideas. It is also lunches. Someone is always stirring something. Someone is always slicing something. Someone is always drinking something from a container that looks like it has survived several inconvenient years. And while a complaint is being formally spoken, you can be sure someone in the crowd is thinking about whether their stew is burning. The law does its best work while everyone is mildly distracted. When a case is heard, the language can be formal, because formality is how you prevent a disagreement from turning into a personal insult. You speak through categories. You speak through recognized terms. You let the ritual carry the heat away. But the heat is still there, under the surface like a coal. And the community can feel it. That's why law exists, to stop coals from becoming fires that spread through families. Sometimes the outcome is a settlement. Sometimes it is a judgment. Sometimes it is an agreement that sounds like a compromise and feels like someone swallowed a stone. Sometimes someone is declared an outlaw, which sounds dramatic, but is also a practical label. Outside legal protection, outside the rules of normal consequence. It is, in a sense, social unplugging. Your access is revoked. And in a harsh environment, being cut loose is not romantic at all. It is logistics. It is winter. But even then, the assembly does not indulge in melodrama. It moves on. Another case waits. Another name is spoken. Another rule is recited. The law speaker continues, voice steady, as if the point of law is not to feel anything, but to keep the collective heartbeat even. The crowd shifts, feet numb, people trading places so someone else can stand closer to the warmth of the center. Someone yawns openly and no one is offended, because everyone understands the truth. Most of governance is boring, and boredom is occasionally the price of peace. A modern analogy drifts in gently, like a blanket you didn't realize you pulled up. Imagine a long meeting where everyone shares one microphone, except no one wants the microphone, and the room is outdoors, and the minutes are kept inside people's heads. Imagine a queue formed by honor rather than numbered tickets. Imagine a legal code that lives as sound. It's strangely intimate. It's also strangely exhausting. It makes you appreciate, in a quiet way, how much of modern life is built to reduce the amount of remembering you have to do. And then, as the assembly days pass, the valley absorbs it all. Arguments. Laughter that is quickly hidden. The clink of silver. The formal phrasing of claims. The ordinary complaints about weather. The occasional solemn oath, sworn on an object that makes the swearer feel watched by something larger than the crowd. You can almost see the law as a kind of net thrown over human behavior, loose enough to allow movement, tight enough to catch you if you run too wildly. When it is time to leave, people pack their booths. Fires are stamped out. The temporary city dissolves back into a valley. The disputes come with them, some resolved, some carried forward like a stone in a pocket. The law speaker's voice fades into memory again, where it will be needed the next time someone insists, politely, that they have been wronged and would like the community to notice. So if you want a small bedtime oath from all this, keep it simple and heavy, like a piece of silver in the palm. Keep facts in one jar, names, dates, words spoken in public. Keep feelings in another, warm, quiet, not asked to testify. When you must speak, speak in order. When you must remember, remember slowly. Let the wind take the extra anger that doesn't help the case. Let the valley keep only what it needs. A steady voice, a workable rule, a crowd that can stand still long enough to pretend to agree. And when your own thoughts begin to wander, let them wander like people leaving Lingvaler at dusk, packing up carefully, stepping softly, following familiar paths until the sound of speech fades and only the calm rhythm of distance is left. You might not expect a medieval town to worry so intensely about the emotional stability of bread. And yet, for long stretches of European history, bread was treated less like a food and more like a public promise that needed supervision. Not because people were dramatic, exactly, but because bread is one of those quiet things that becomes extremely important the moment it is missing. In a small town with damp streets and wooden shutters, a loaf can feel like the difference between a calm afternoon and a week of grumbling. So tonight, in the gentlest possible way, we're going to drift through the dull, oddly specific world of medieval English price controls, the assize of bread and ale, the weighing of loaves, the tasting of beer, and the sleepy bureaucracy that tried to keep everyone nourished and only moderately annoyed. And before we wander too far into flour and foam, I'll ask the usual soft question: where and what time are you listening from? In medieval England, the price of bread was not just whatever the baker feels like. It was tied, in a surprisingly methodical way, to the price of grain. In some places and periods, officials treated wheat prices like the weather. You couldn't control it, but you could react to it. When grain got expensive, the loaf didn't always get smaller by secret choice. It got adjusted by rule. This is not romantic. It's accounting with crumbs. And it's also a little comforting because it suggests that even in the distant past, someone was quietly trying to stop the most predictable scams from happening before breakfast. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or you can save your energy for something truly strenuous, like remembering how many ounces should be in a penny loaf. Honestly, no one should strain themselves over medieval units. Medieval units already strained everyone back. The basic idea of the assize of bread and ale is simple enough to say and tedious enough to enforce. Bread, especially the common kinds, was expected to have a standard weight for a standard price, and that standard shifted as grain prices shifted. It's like a menu where the price stays the same and the portion changes, except the portion changes according to a chart, and the chart is treated with the solemnity of a sacred text, and the sacred text is made of numbers. You can almost imagine a town officer with damp sleeves and a very serious expression, holding a little table of conversions as if it were a prayer book. The loaves themselves came in categories with names that sound as if they were designed to be said aloud in a slow voice. White bread made from finer flour, bread made from mixed grains, darker loaves with more bran, smaller loaves for smaller coins. Bakers did not simply bake bread, they baked a social gradient. Flour quality mattered, not only for taste, but for status. White bread could signal comfort. Brown bread could signal endurance. And the law, in its usual unromantic way, tried to define these things not by feelings, but by weight and ingredients. Imagine the baker's daily rhythm. The work starts early because the oven is slow to heat and people are fast to complain. Flour is measured, water is added, salt appears in careful pinches. Dough is kneaded until it becomes smooth, elastic, and vaguely resentful. Ovens are fueled with wood, charcoal, whatever the town and season allow. The smell spreads into the street like an announcement. Today has begun. It is hard to keep a secret when you are baking bread. The whole neighborhood knows your schedule. Now imagine that you re a baker and you have a problem that never dies. Flour prices change. Some weeks the grain is dear. Some weeks it is thankfully ordinary. If you shrink the loaf too much, people notice. If you don't shrink it when grain is expensive, you don't make money. And in a world where margins are thin and winters are long, not making money is not a philosophy. It's a practical threat. So the assize tries to offer a third thing, an official standardized compromise. So the argument is not between you and your customers, but between everyone in a chart. It's easier to be angry at a rule than at a person you might meet tomorrow. Enforcement is where the story becomes especially slow and strangely tactile. Officials could inspect loaves, weigh them, and check them against expected standards. And weighing a loaf sounds simple until you remember that scales are fussy. Weights can be borrowed, and wind can blow into the tent or stall where you're trying to do your job. The act of checking bread is quietly theatrical. The loaf sits there. The scale settles. The official watches it like a person watching a candle flame, trying to decide if it's steady or secretly leaning. Everyone nearby pretends not to stare while staring with complete sincerity. There's also a mild absurdity in the way trust is treated like a physical substance. A good loaf, properly weighted, becomes proof of decent governance. A light loaf becomes proof that civilization is collapsing and someone should be scolded. It's a lot of responsibility for something that is mostly flour and time. Bread is, in a way, the most boring miracle humans ever domesticated. You mix dust with water and it becomes dinner. It's no wonder people wanted rules around it. When something is that basic, it feels too important to leave to chance. And the rules were not only about bread. Ale mattered too, because ale was everyday hydration in a world where water quality could be unpredictable. And everyone's stomach had learned to be cautious. Medieval ale was often weaker than modern beer, not always, but often enough to make it more like a fermented daily drink than a dramatic party. People brewed at home. People brewed for sale. People brewed because grains could become calories through fermentation in a way that felt slightly safer than trusting a suspicious-looking stream. Ale, like bread, was ordinary until it wasn't. When ale was watered down too much, or sold too dear, people felt cheated in exactly the way you feel cheated when something comforting fails you quietly. So towns had ale tasters and ale inspectors, sometimes called ale conners in later usage, and their job. Sounds charming until you imagine the actual working conditions. Walking from alehouse to alehouse, sniffing, sipping, inspecting measures, dealing with people who are tired, busy, and not thrilled that you are here. The ale inspector is a medieval version of a health inspector, except the clipboard is in your head. And the consequences can involve public shame rather than a politely worded notice taped to a window. There are stories, some recorded later, repeated with affection, that ale tasters had to sit on benches wetted with ale to see if it was too sticky, or that leather breeches would adhere if sugar or other additives were present. Measures themselves become their own sleepy universe. A town might standardize the size of cups, jugs, and barrels, because if you can't trust the container, you can't trust the price. This is where words like gallon and quart start to feel like old ghosts, drifting through time, changing shape, but remaining stubbornly present. Ale is sold by measure, and measure is enforced by people with official authority and unofficial boredom. Somewhere, someone is carving marks into a wooden vessel to show legal volume. Somewhere else, someone is trying to sand those marks away. Human nature does not change much. It simply wears different aprons. Now, if you gently zoom out, you start to see why a town would care about this at all. Bread and ale are not luxury goods, they are staples. When staples become untrustworthy, the whole social mood sours. And medieval towns, like modern comment sections, could become moody quickly. A baker who routinely cheats can create resentment that spreads beyond the bakery. An ale seller who waters their ale too much can create the kind of low, constant irritation that makes neighbors less generous, less patient, less willing to cooperate on other things. So officials treated small fraud as a kind of public toxin, not because they were saints, but because they enjoyed living in a town that didn't feel like it was constantly being cheated. It's also useful to remember that officials were often local people. Towns had bailiffs, constables, and other officers whose authority came from a blend of custom, local appointment, and broader legal structures that reached up toward the crown and the realm, but the actual enforcement could be intensely local. Your inspector might be your neighbor. Your neighbor might have opinions about your bread. That alone encourages careful baking. Nothing motivates honesty like the fear of seeing the same person at the market twice. Punishments, when they happened, didn't always involve grand spectacle, but they could involve public embarrassment. This is one of the medieval world's most reliable tools. Shame as a civic technology. The pillory, for instance, is a well-known device in later imagination, and while we don't need to linger on it, it is enough to know that being publicly marked as dishonest was meant to be unpleasant in a way that didn't require complex paperwork. A fine is forgettable if you can afford it. A public scolding can live in someone's memory for a long time. It is, from the perspective of a small community, an efficient kind of punishment. Cruel sometimes, yes, but efficient like a stamp on a letter. And yet, even the system tries to pretend it is not emotional. The law is written and spoken in a way that sounds neutral. Weights, measures, prices, standards. It is the language of this many ounces and this many pennies. But underneath it, everyone understands that these standards are about survival and trust. The loaf is not just a loaf. It is a signal that the town is working. It is a tidy public contract you can eat. One of the quieter curiosities is how much this relies on the idea that fairness can be engineered. Grain prices rise and fall, so the assize provides a predictable response. It's an early form of regulation that tries to match reality without chasing it too wildly. Even today, we do similar things with fuel prices, utility regulation, consumer protections, just with more forms and fewer flour-dusted sleeves. The medieval version is cruder, but the intention is familiar. Keep things stable enough that people don't feel constantly tricked. Stability, it turns out, is a kind of comfort. It's the warmest thing in a cold world. Imagine the marketplace itself, because the marketplace is where the law becomes visible. Stalls line a street or a square. There's noise, but not the noise of dramatic excitement. More the noise of constant bargaining, small talk, and the soft complaints of animals. Bread is stacked in neat piles or kept in baskets to look abundant even when it's not. Ale is poured with deliberate care so the foam behaves. Someone is shouting the price of something that is definitely not as good as they claim. Someone else is pretending to walk away to get a better deal. This is commerce as theater, and the law is backstage, occasionally stepping out to check the props. When inspectors appear, people adjust their faces. Honest sellers look like honest sellers, which is to say they look nervous anyway because no one likes being checked. Dishonest sellers look like honest sellers too, because practice makes performance. And the inspector, who might prefer to be at home, must decide with limited tools what is true. This is why the law becomes procedural. Procedure is what you use when you can't read minds. You measure, you weigh, you repeat, you compare. You try to turn suspicion into a number, and then there are the strangely intimate details, the ones that could never make it into a heroic chronicle. The inspector touches the loaf and feels its crust. They might break it to check crumb, weight, and texture. A loaf can feel heavy in the hand but still be wrong. It can be dense. It can be damp. It can be made with flour that is not what it pretends to be. Bakers have tricks, adding more water, using cheaper grains, pleasing the eye while cheating the scale. None of this is shocking. It is simply the natural relationship between regulation and creativity. If you set a rule, someone tests it. If you test it, someone adapts. The system becomes a slow dance where no one is entirely relaxed. Ale has its own tricks. Watering it down is the obvious one, but there are also questions of freshness, cleanliness, and strength. Ale spoils, barrels leak. Brewing varies from household to household like personal handwriting. In some places, women were prominent brewers and cellars, running alehouses as part of household economies. That means regulation touches not only commerce but domestic life. When you regulate ale, you regulate kitchens. You regulate the invisible labor of stirring, heating, cleaning, fermenting, and trying not to waste precious grain. Somewhere, someone is offended that their ale is being judged. Somewhere else, someone is relieved because the neighbor's ale really is dreadful. The deeper you drift into this, the more it starts to feel like a town's attempt to maintain a shared mood. Bread and ale are not just consumption. They're social lubrication. They are the thing you bring to a table. They are the thing you offer a traveler. They are the thing that makes a hard day softer at the edges. And if those comforts become unreliable, people become harsher. So regulation is quietly a form of emotional management. The town is trying to keep itself from becoming brittle. There's also the slow, unglamorous reality that these rules were unevenly applied. Enforcement depends on capacity, on corruption, on local politics, on whether the inspector has time, on whether the baker is connected to someone important, on whether the town is busy, on whether winter has made everyone too tired to argue. The law, as always, has ideals, and then it has Tuesday. Tuesday is when everyone compromises with reality. Tuesday is when the inspector says, "This is close enough," because the wind is cold and the next stall is calling. Still, the existence of the assize tells us something steady. People believed that ordinary life was worth regulating carefully. Not just rail taxes, not just war, not just big drum of ordinary bread. Ordinary ale. The kind of things that, if you think about them too long, become surprisingly profound. Bread is society made edible. Ale is grain turned into conversation. These are daily rituals, and rituals attract rules the way candles attract moths. So you can picture a medieval town, not only with churches and walls and markets, but with invisible lines of expectation. The baker knows the accepted size of a loaf or a penny. The ale seller knows the accepted measure for a cup. The officer knows the penalties, at least roughly. The customers know what they feel is fair, which is often more influential than what the law actually says. and all of it is wrapped in a shared understanding that fairness is not a luxury. It is the thing that stops people from becoming dangerously creative with their anger. If you want a final, sleepy little idea to carry away from all this, let it be this. Some of history, as strange as seriousness, is reserved for the most ordinary things. Keep facts in one jar weights, measures, grain prices scribbled into memory. Keep feelings in another warmth, hunger, the small relief of a good loaf that does not surprise you. Let the town inspector walk on in your imagination, boots soft on mud, scales balanced carefully, face calm with practiced neutrality. Let the baker's oven glow without drama. Let the ale foam settle in peace. And if your thoughts begin to drift, let them drift like a market closing at desk voices lowering stalls, folding bread baskets, emptying not with panic, but with the gentle certainty that tomorrow will also need boring rolls, and someone somewhere will once again weigh something ordinary and call it justice. You can tell a warning has done its job when it starts to look boring. Not harmless, exactly, but settled. Like a stove that has gone from roaring flame to a steady, polite heat you could warm your hands over without thinking too much. A Níðstöng is not meant to be cozy, of course. It is meant to be unmistakable. But time has a way of sanding even sharp messages into something that feels almost administrative. A pole in the ground, a shape at the top, a direction fixed like a finger pointing, and then the long sleepy waiting while wind quietly does the work that people would rather not do face to face. If you're still awake as we drift into the paperwork of curses, because yes, even curses can develop paperwork, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The pole will not take it personally. The wind is famously neutral. And the ravens, if they have opinions, keep them to themselves in a very disciplined way. When a community believes a Níðstöng has been heard, the first sign is often not thunder or a sudden moral awakening, but ordinary human movement. A man takes a longer route to the virtualization of his own courage. Someone chooses another path along the ridge rather than past the boundary ditch where the pole stands. A household closes their shutters earlier. A few animals are moved closer to the buildings, not for any dramatic reason, but because people like their animals near when the night feels slightly less friendly than usual. It's the kind of adjustment you barely notice, like moving your phone to the other side of the bed after an annoying notification. Minor changes made quietly to reduce contact with something you'd rather not acknowledge. Sometimes the sign at work is that someone sends surety. Medieval and Viking age law can be strangely fond of surety, which is a calm word for a deeply social concept. Someone vouches for someone else. It's not exactly an apology. It's not exactly a payment. It's more like a person stepping forward and saying, in a firm but tired voice, if he doesn't behave, you can blame me. Surety is a human bridge built over a gap where trust has cracked. It's also a reminder that communities ran on relationships more than on abstract principles. Everyone is connected to someone, and sometimes justice simply follows the strongest connection like a cat following the warmest lap. If surety arrives, it can change the next steps. The Níðstöng is not necessarily left to rot as a permanent neighborhood feature. Like a strange lamppost nobody remembers installing, it may be taken down. The act of lowering it can be as ritualized as the raising, and in some accounts, the head or the symbol, however it's arranged, might be buried or disposed of in a way that suggests closure. And notice how politely we're speaking about this. We are not describing anything vivid. We are describing decisions, procedures, quiet tasks done with cold fingers. That is, honestly, how most frightening things live in real life, not as constant shocks, but as chores. The burial, when it happens, has a logic that is both spiritual and practical. If the message is meant to travel toward someone, you might bury it facing away or down, or in some direction that feels like closing the mouth. People treat direction as a kind of grammar. The head points, the eye's face. The wind carries, so if you want to end it, you change the grammar. You interrupt the sentence. You fold the message and put it under the ground like a letter you do not want anyone to open again. There's a softness to that, even if the original act was meant to be harsh. You get the sense that people understood escalation and then also understood fatigue. A community cannot live forever at full anger. Eventually, even anger wants to put on a cloak and sit down. But not every Níðstöng ends with tidy closure. Sometimes the pole stays longer than anyone planned because no one wants to be the person who goes out and touches it. There is a special kind of reluctance reserved for cursed objects. It's not fear in a dramatic sense, more like the same feeling you get when you're not sure if a pot is hot and you don't really want to test it with your hand. Someone might joke about it during daylight. Someone might describe it as just wood. And then as evening comes, that same someone will walk around it anyway. Because jokes are lighter than consequences. Weather plays a quiet role, as it always does. Rain softens rope. Frost stiffens it. Wind loosens knots with patient fingers. A pole left out too long begins to look less like a deliberate instrument and more like a neglected tool. The wood darkens, the markings fade, the smell changes from sharp to dull. And the community, watching this slow decay, may experience a very unromantic relief. The problem is literally weathering away. It's hard to stay furious when your cymbals are sagging. The universe, in its lazy way, is reminding you that everything becomes compost eventually, even anger with a name carved into it. And then there are birds. In Norse imagination, birds can feel like witnesses. In practical reality, birds are opportunists. Ravens, crows, gulls near the coast, anyone with wings and a willingness to investigate. If something is displayed, birds will notice. They do not care about honor. They care about, is this edible? And is this shiny? And is this worth landing near? Which creates a strangely sleepy, deflating contrast. Humans put up this symbol loaded with meaning, and a raven looks at it like an unlabeled lunch. There's something almost comforting there. The natural world refuses to take our dramatics seriously. It continues to be busy with its own small priorities. Sometimes a counter curse is raised, or at least a counter gesture. People hear the warning, and rather than submit, they respond. This can be as simple as calling a meeting of elders, or demanding a formal settlement, or insisting that words must be taken back in the same public way they were given. And that's a fascinating detail because it shows that public speech is treated like a physical act. If you throw a curse into the community like a stone, the stone doesn't vanish. Someone has to pick it up. Someone has to decide where it belongs. If a counter curse exists at all, it might be less about magic and more about refusing to let one person write the narrative. It's a battle over who gets to define shame, which is, in a way, a battle over who gets to define reality. But even counter gestures tend to arrive wrapped in procedure. Talk first. Witnesses, negotiation, compensation, a demand for apologies, or at least for the performance of regret. The law is a set of slow steps, and even in a world with curses, people often prefer slow steps to sudden blows. It's as if everyone is quietly aware that once violence begins, it is difficult to make it stop politely, so they cling to words, to meetings, to the careful counting of damages, to the ritual of having someone stand up and say, "I will be responsible." Like that sentence is a rope thrown across dark water. When settlement happens, it can look almost disappointingly plain. Fresh posts are set up not as threats, but as ordinary boundary markers. A ditch is maintained. Stones are placed. The new markers are meant to be harmless, forgettable, the kind of thing you glance at and then immediately stop thinking about. In a way, that's the true opposite of a Níðstöng. The Níðstöng screams. The boundary marker whispers. And communities, once they've had enough screaming, often prefer the whisper. Let the land do the talking quietly. Let the post say, "This far, no further," without involving anyone's honor. Honor is exhausting. Posts are restful. There's a modern analogy here, soft and small. It's like when a dispute online turns into a public thread long, visible, full of tension, and then eventually someone sends a private message and the whole thing ends with a brief, boring note. Resolved. People rarely announce the details of resolution. They just stop yelling, and everyone scrolls on. In the medieval landscape, the poll is the public thread. The settlement post is the resolved. It's less satisfying, less dramatic. It is also, if you're trying to sleep, much better. Now, let's drift into the idea of undoing a curse. Not by grand magic, but by careful social repair. Repair is often the least glamorous part of any conflict. The raising of the pole is dramatic. The words are sharp. People remember it. But undoing it is often a sequence of tiny, careful actions, like sewing a tear in a garment with thread, so fine no one notices the stitch. Someone speaks to someone else in daylight. Someone agrees to pay compensation, not necessarily because they believe they were wrong, but because paying is quieter than fighting. Someone else agrees to accept it, not necessarily because they feel healed, but because they would like winter to pass without constant tension. Winter matters here more than we like to admit. A feud is easier to sustain when the weather is pleasant and mobility is simple. But when the days shorten and travel becomes harder, anger becomes less efficient. You can't keep riding out to argue when the ground is ice and your fingers hurt. Even the most proud person eventually notices the practical inconvenience of constant hostility. The cold is a kind of mediator. It doesn't care about the outcome. It simply makes certain behaviors less appealing. In a way, the season itself becomes part of law. Not written, not spoken, but felt. And this brings us to the quietest part, the community's decision to forget. Not completely, not honestly, but in the way humans forget most things, by placing them behind more pressing concerns. A pole that once felt like a crisis becomes a story someone tells in a low voice while repairing a net, or while sharpening a tool, or while pretending not to gossip. Do you remember that time? Becomes anyway, and then the conversation moves to the price of grain, or the condition of a boat, or the question of who has enough hay for the animals. Ordinary life is a gentle eraser. It doesn't scrub clean. It just writes new layers over the old. If you listen closely, the success of a Níðstöng is not necessarily that it ruins someone. Sometimes it succeeds simply by forcing a decision. Settlement, apology, open feud movement. That's what it demands. It's a boundary object. It sits at the edge of law and says, if the court fails, the landscape will remember. And landscapes do remember in their own way. A post, a ditch, a cairn. The ground stores human choices without commentary. It is the quietest archive imaginable. There's also something important in how communal the whole ritual is. A Níðstöng is not a private curse whispered into a pillow. It is public. It requires witnesses, or at least it benefits from them. It relies on the community's shared understanding of what shame means. That makes it less like magic and more like social technology. It's a tool for broadcasting a complaint when other channels feel blocked. In modern terms, it's like placing a notice where everyone must see it, except the notice is carved into wood and aimed at your enemy's farm. It is not subtle. Subtlety is for people who feel safe. And because it is public, it also must be publicly diffused. A settlement in private might not satisfy the community as need to see that the situation has changed. People want to know whether the warning stands, whether they should be afraid, whether they should choose sides. A quiet negotiation might be enough for the parties involved, but the wider group needs a signal too. So the pole coming down or being buried or being replaced with plain boundary posts, becomes that signal. It tells everyone you can start being boring again, and being boring is, in many ways, the goal of a stable community. Boring means predictable. Predictable means safe. Safe means you can sleep. If we let the mind drift back over the earlier steps, the choosing, the carving, the placing, the pointing, everything seems to revolve around control. Not control of the weather or fate or the future. Control of narrative, at least. Control of who is shamed and why. Control of how a community reacts when it feels wronged. The breath pattern, the low voice, the repeated phrases, these are all ways of making a message stick. And what undoes it is often the opposite. Dilution, silence, waiting, a decision not to repeat the words. A decision to stop feeding the wind with fresh syllables. Because repetition is how these things stay alive. You repeat the curse and the wind learns it, as the poetic descriptions like to say. You repeat the story and the community learns it too. And if you want the story to fade, you stop repeating. You let the pole become just a pole. You let the carved marks become just scratches. You let the neighborhood path grow used again, because people are tired of taking the long way around their own lives. There's a very human irony in this. The Níðstöng exists because words can't be taken back easily. Once spoken publicly, they hang in the air like smoke. But the end of the Níðstöng often comes when everyone quietly agrees to treat the smoke as if it has gone. Not because it truly vanished, but because the room needs to be lived in again. Sometimes the most powerful act is not a new statement, but an old statement starved of attention until it becomes thin. So if you're letting yourself drift towards sleep, you can imagine the final scene in slow, unexciting detail. The valley is quieter than it was the night the pole went up. The wind still moves, but without urgency, just doing its ordinary work of moving air from one place to another, like a person rearranging papers on a desk without looking at them. The old rope has softened, the wood has chilled. The ground is firm. Somewhere a neighbor wakes early and does not think about the pole for several minutes, which is a small miracle of its own. And if someone does go out, maybe with an elder, maybe with a reluctant helper, they move slowly. They do not dramatize it. They inspect knots like people inspecting knots. They loosen things that need loosening. They lower the pole with the kind of care you give to any object that is both awkward and meaningful. They do not rush, because rushing would make it feel alive again. They keep their voices low. They say only what they can prove in daylight, because daylight makes even harsh words look slightly embarrassed. After that, there may be new posts, plain posts. The kind of posts you could lean a tool against. The kind of posts no one will sing about. The boundary becomes routine again. Start, speak, witness, leave becomes simply start, work, eat, sleep. The horse grows quiet, in the sense that the horse is no longer part of the conversation. The pole stands watch only in memory, and memory is soft around the edges when it is not constantly sharpened. Keep facts in one jar: name, act, remedy, the direction the head once pointed, the season it happened, the neighbor who witnessed it. Keep anger in another small, tied tight, and cold by morning. Let the wind carry nothing you will regret. And if peace is offered, take it in steps. You can walk back without shame, because the best kind of ending is the one that doesn't. So you feel like an ending at all, just the gradual return of boring nights, ordinary paths, and the gentle, steady quiet that lets a whole valley fall asleep without needing to keep watch. You might not expect a government to declare war on daylight in such a calm, paperwork-heavy way. But here we are, quietly counting windows, as if the sun itself has filed a tax return and is now waiting for approval. Somewhere inside an 18th century street, a person stands with a quill, a measuring glance, and the faint confidence of someone who believes a square of glass is a reasonable unit of income. The air is still. A curtain hangs. A single pane catches the moon and looks for a moment, like a coin held flat. And while we're here, moving slowly through the gentle arithmetic of architecture, if you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The window tax won't care either way. It never learned to care. It only learned to count dot in England and Wales. A tax on windows was introduced in the late 1600s, and it lasted, with adjustments, well into the 1800s. The premise was soothingly simple, in the way that simple premises often are. If you have many windows, you probably have a large house, and if you have a large house, you probably have a large wallet hiding somewhere behind a door with good hinges. It was, in a sense, a property tax that avoided the awkward step of admitting it was a property tax. The tax did not ask what your house was worth. It asked how much light you were allowing to enter it. If your home was bright, the state assumed you could afford to share that brightness. In cash dot, the counting could be strangely literal. Imagine the assessor arriving like an early low-tech algorithm. He does not need to understand your personality. He has only one question: how many openings do you have that face the world with glass? And the house, being a house, answers silently by existing. Some windows are grand and symmetrical, proud enough to be seen from across the street. Others are small and practical, meant for stairwells, for attics, for the kind of rooms where nobody writes poetry and everybody folds laundry. The assessor counts them all because the tax does not differentiate between poetic light and laundry light. Light is light. A rectangle is a rectangle. The state, as usual, prefers shapes. Naturally, people responded to being charged for sunlight with the deep creativity of anyone who has just met a new rule. Windows began to disappear. Not dramatically, no one held a ceremonial farewell for the kitchen window, but quietly, one at a time, with bricks. Whole rows of windows were blocked up, leaving a strange, sleepy geometry on building faces, symmetrical patterns interrupted by solid patches, as if houses were blinking. Some bricked-up windows remained visible as outlines, ghosts of frames set into the wall, a reminder that there used to be an opening there, and someone, at some point, decided the opening was too expensive to keep. If you've ever deleted a subscription because you weren't using it enough, the logic is similar. Just with masonry and a colder draft, there are small absurdities inside this, and they arrive softly like tiny jokes whispered by the past. A house might keep one window and lose another, not for romance, but for math. A household might argue about which room deserves light, as if daylight is a limited resource you can allocate like the nicer plate at dinner. One can imagine a family standing in a dim hallway, insisting they don't mind the gloom while their eyes quietly disagree. And one can imagine the state, far away, being pleased that the numbers went down, because numbers are what the state can see most clearly. Of course, taxes rarely travel alone. The window tax existed in a world where other taxes had already made people familiar with the idea that the home could be measured in odd ways. There had been hearth taxes, earlier taxes on fireplaces, so warmth had already been counted. In a sense, one chimney at a time. The window tax simply moved from warmth to light, from hearth to pane, from the cozy center of the room to the bright edge of it. The domestic space became a ledger, and the ledger became a kind of architecture critic. It's a gentle reminder that governments, like board shoppers, will eventually inspect every feature you didn't think was a feature. What makes all this even sleepier is how the tax invites you to picture not dramatic moments, but routines. The slow work of bricklayers, the patient mixing of mortar, the careful matching of bricks so the wall doesn't look too embarrassed. Someone pays for the work, not to improve their life, but to subtract a liability. It's renovation as subtraction, home improvement as a form of hiding, and the result is a room that holds heat differently, air differently, dust differently. A bricked-up window is not just a wall. It's a change in how a room breathes. You can almost hear the room sighing, trying to adjust, like a person who has lost a familiar habit and is now living with the small, persistent discomfort of change. Asterisk now, without hurrying. Let's drift from the street and into the quiet logic behind the rule. Because the rule itself is made of softer material than it seems, assumptions. The assumption that wealth shows itself. The assumption that people who can afford more windows can afford more tax. The assumption, too, that windows are stable and countable, not tricky things that invite arguments about definitions. Is a small aperture a window? Is a cellar slit a window? What about a glazed door that is technically a door, but also, frankly, a large upright window with ambitions? Bureaucracy loves a clear category, and architecture loves to blur categories the way fog blurs fences. You can imagine sleepy disputes. A homeowner insisting something is a vent, not a window, because the opening is too small to be proud of. An assessor squinting at a pane and deciding that yes, it counts, because it contains glass and faces outward, and therefore participates in the economy of daylight. The law may write down window, but in real life, window is a negotiation between a human with a list and a human with a wall. There is something tenderly ridiculous about it. The sun rises, birds do their bird work, and two people argue in low voices about whether a hole in a building qualifies as taxable optimism. Sometimes certain groups were exempted or taxed differently, and the rules shifted over time because rules always do. That's another sleepy pleasure of historical taxes. They never stay still. Rates change. Thresholds change. Exemptions appear and vanish like small animals in grass. The tax becomes less like a single rule and more like an evolving creature that keeps trying to find the best place to bite. And the population, equally adaptable, keeps learning new ways to avoid being bitten in expensive places. It is tempting, in modern conversation, to attach dramatic phrases to the window tax, like the idea that it caused widespread illness, or that it stole the light from the poor in a way that reshaped health. It certainly encouraged dimmer interiors in some cases, and it certainly influenced building choices. But history is rarely a clean single-cause machine. It is more like a cluttered drawer where many objects touch each other and nothing sits alone. The window tax is one object in that drawer. It knocks against fuel costs, against urban crowding, against damp weather, against the simple fact that old buildings can be dark even without government assistance. Still, the image of a bricked window remains powerful precisely because it feels tangible. You can walk by it. You can touch the outline. You can see where money became mortar, and there's a special kind of humor quiet, respectful, slightly silly, in the way a tax becomes visible art. Most taxes vanish into paperwork. This one left scars on buildings. It left patterns. It created a style, accidentally. If you've ever wondered why a certain old building looks like it has a neat row of blank windows, there's a chance you're looking at an argument from centuries ago, fossilized in brick. It's like finding an ancient comment thread, except the comments are made of masonry and the moderator is the treasury. Now let's wander further inward, into the rooms themselves, because the real story of a window tax is not the tax. It's the interior life that adapts to it. A room with fewer windows changes its behavior. It grows more dependent on candles and oil lamps. It becomes more sensitive to soot. The ceiling darkens more quickly. Fabrics absorb smells more stubbornly. And the people inside grow used to reading by a smaller circle of light, the way people today grow used to staring into the small rectangle of a phone screen at night. There's a softness to that comparison. The rectangle is smaller, but it's still a rectangle. The human eye, ever adaptable, will accept a surprising amount of compromise, as long as the compromise becomes normal. In these dimmer rooms, you notice how many domestic tasks are basically negotiations with light. Sewing, for example, becomes slower and more intimate, the needle seeking the thread like a tiny creature looking for a home. Writing becomes more personal because you must sit close to the flame, and flames have that quiet habit of making you feel alone with your thoughts. Cooking becomes a choreography of shadows. Even cleaning changes. Dust behaves differently when it is not betrayed by strong daylight. You can be forgiven in a gloomy room for believing you are tidier than you are. Darkness is generous that way. It gives everybody a free pass, like a forgiving camera filter dot, and then there are the social rituals that depend on windows without people noticing. A window is not just for light. It is for observing the street without participating in it. It is the original, quietly watching what's going on. When windows disappear or shrink, the street changes too. Less casual observation, less neighborly surveillance, more privacy, but also more isolation. And that is fascinating because the tax that was meant to measure wealth ended up nudging the social texture of neighborhoods. It's a reminder that policy doesn't just move money, it moves attention. It changes what people see, literally, asterisk. And then there are the social rituals that depend on windows without people noticing. A window is not just for light. It is for observing the street without participating in it. It is the original, quietly watching what's going on. When windows disappear or shrink, the street changes too. Less casual observation, less neighborly surveillance, more privacy, but also more isolation. And that is fascinating, because the tax that was meant to measure wealth ended up nudging the social texture of neighborhoods. It's a reminder that policy doesn't just move money, it moves attention. It changes what people see, literally. Of course, not everyone bricked up windows. Many could afford the tax or chose not to reshape their homes around it. And some houses, especially grand ones, treated windows as a form of prestige. The point of a grand facade is often to be seen, and windows are part of the face. You don't remove your face because it costs money. You pay the money and keep the face. This is how status works. It is expensive on purpose. In some places, you can almost imagine the pride of keeping every window open and counted, like a person proudly paying for a premium plan just because they can. Not because they use all the features. Because the feature is being able to dot now, we can drift into the making of windows themselves. Because a window is not just an opening. It's a small industrial miracle. Glass production improved over time, and different techniques created different kinds of panes, some clearer, some bubbled, some with gentle ripples that bend the world slightly, making the outside look like it's underwater. Those ripples are one of the most soothing sights in old glass. They remind you that even transparency has texture. The tax did not care about texture. The tax did not care if your glass was flawless or wavy. But the people living behind it certainly knew the difference. Clear glass makes the world crisp. Wavy glass makes it gentle. Some people, even now, prefer the gentle. Window frames have their own sleepy details too. Sash windows, which slide up and down, became a kind of standard in many British contexts, part of the neat geometry of Georgian architecture. They are also, quietly, a system of cords and weights hidden inside the frame, which feels like a small mechanical secret. Every time a sash window opens smoothly, there's a little counterweight doing its job in silence, like the least celebrated employee in history. If you brick up a sash window, you bury not just light, but a tiny mechanism that was made to move. There's something mildly tragic in that, but only mildly. Like leaving a perfectly good umbrella at home on a rainy day. And yes, umbrellas were taxed too in other contexts. And hats, and salt, and paper, and soap, and just about anything that could be counted. Humans are endlessly countable. That's the quiet joke. We invent objects, and the objects become part of our lives. And then someone notices the object and thinks calmly, this could help fund the Navy. It's not personal. It's just arithmetic dressed in authority. If we bring our attention back to the window text. One of its most charmingly boring features is that it encouraged people to think like designers. Not designers in the modern sense, with mood boards and fonts, but in the practical sense of balancing aesthetics, function, and cost. How many windows are enough? Which ones can be sacrificed? Can you keep the symmetry from the street while blocking interior light? Some people bricked up windows from the inside so the exterior still looked polite, like a person smiling while feeling slightly annoyed. The house kept its public face. Only the inhabitants knew the interior had changed. This is architectural diplomacy, keeping up appearances while quietly making cuts. Now, let's glide into the quiet work of enforcement and record keeping, because history often rests not on grand speeches but on ledgers and lists. Taxes require documentation. Someone somewhere had to write down numbers, assign rates, keep track of changes. The phrasing of these records can be wonderfully dry. Not a home with a cheerful view, but a dwelling with X windows. Not a family who enjoys morning light, but liable for Y. The human story is flattened into integers. And yet, those integers, centuries later, are sometimes all we have. A historian reads a tax record and imagines a house. A house becomes a life. A life becomes a faint outline. And the outline is traced in ink, slow and careful, by someone who probably wanted to go home. Asterisk. This is a good moment for a small micro hook. A little quiet oddity. Some people tried to get clever with what counts as a window, and the law responded as laws do by defining things more tightly, and by creating new categories that invite new loopholes. This is the eternal dance. People step sideways. The law steps sideways. Everyone is moving, but nobody's dancing for joy. It's more like two tired people in a narrow hallway trying to get past each other, politely at times. The window tax was adjusted, and later it was repealed. The repeal itself is almost anticlimactic. No dramatic scene. The tax simply ends, and yet the buildings don't instantly reopen their eyes. Brick is stubborn. Once you've closed a window, you don't always rush to bring it back, especially if you've grown used to living with less light. Habits like mortar set. So even after a law changes, its ghost can remain on the street for a long time, not as a haunting, but as inertia. Now we can drift into the wider emotional temperature careful. Not dramatic of what it means to live in a world where the home is measured by features that seem intimate. A window feels personal. It's where you stand when you're thinking. It's where you rest your hand on the sill without realizing you're doing it. To tax that is to remind people that privacy is never absolute. The state doesn't need to enter your house to affect it. It only needs to alter what your house can afford to be. And that's a quiet power, a power that speaks in numbers and looks from a distance, almost polite, but people adapt, and adaptation is the most boring form of resilience, which makes it perfect for sleep. A household rearranges furniture to sit nearer the remaining light. A mirror is placed to catch and bounce brightness into a room, turning a small ray into a broader glow. Whitewash becomes more appealing because white surfaces help light travel like a gentle encouragement. Curtains change. Candles are rationed. The day is organized around the brightest hours. In winter, when daylight is short, the whole problem feels more intense. In summer, perhaps it feels less urgent, like a fee you can forget about until the bill comes. If you've ever lived in a room with one good window and 3 walls that do their best to be gloomy, you'll understand the psychology. The window becomes important. You notice its moods. You notice when it's weak, when clouds flatten it, when it shines. You become unintentionally a weather observer. And in the 18th century, without modern lighting, the stakes of that observation were higher, but the habit was the same, watching the sky because it controls what you can do. And yet, in spite of everything, the daily life continues. People cook, people mend, people talk softly. Children move through shadows like small animals adapted to dimness. Someone hums while wiping a table, because humming is a free light of its own, a little internal brightness. The house, even with fewer windows, becomes normal again. Normal is what humans do best. Normal is how we survive. Normal is also how we forget Dot, so as we drift toward the end of this quiet walk through taxed daylight, you can imagine a street at night. The windows that remain are dark, with a few warm rectangles where someone is still awake. The bricked-up windows are just parts of the wall now, no longer surprising, no longer worth remarking on. The outlines fade into the building's face. The tax collector is long gone. The law is a memory, but the architecture remains, still holding the shape of old decisions. The way a tree holds the bend of a branch that was tied down years ago. Keep facts in one jar dates. Laws, rates, and the simple habit of counting. Keep feelings in another small, quiet, and allowed to cool. Let your thoughts do what old streets do, soften into routine. The house does not need to explain itself anymore. It just stands there, half lit, half closed, politely ignoring the sky while the sky keeps offering light anyway, again and again, with the endless patience of something that has never charged a fee. Asterisk. You might not expect the most delicate part of a Viking curse to be the safety precautions, but it often is. Not the dramatic words. Not the horse head staring into the wind like a frozen question. The careful part is what happens around the edges, where ordinary people quietly try to make sure the curse does not bounce back into their own lives like a badly thrown stone. A Níðstöng is a public message, yes, but it is also a moment where a community practices the very old skill of keeping trouble at arm's length, preferably with both hands. If you're still awake by the time we finish discussing why someone might lightly tap a pole with a knife and then tap the ground as well, you can subscribe. Or don't. Either way, the poll will not send you a confirmation email, and the Ravens will not leave a review. The only rating system here is whether the warning is believed, and even that is usually decided in silence. Over breakfast, once the witness has heard the words, and the poll is standing, the mood does not become triumphant. It becomes cautious, because a curse in this context is not a magic spell you cast from a safe distance. It is a social act. You are accusing someone publicly enough that the wind can carry the accusation to other ears. And in a world where reputation can be as practical as a roof, you don't want your own roof to mysteriously develop problems. So the person raising the Níðstöng tends to move like someone who has just posted a very pointed note on a door and would now like to return home without collecting extra drama on the wait out one small practice you sometimes see in descriptions and reconstructions is the symbolic use of tools. A knife, for example, is not only a weapon. In daily life, it is an object that does boring work. Cutting rope, slicing bread, shaping wood, trimming something that needs trimming. It is the kind of tool that belongs in a belt, not in a legend. When a knife is brought into the ritual space, it can act as a quiet signature. Not in a theatrical way, but in the same way you might initial a document. Touch the blade to the pole. Touch the blade to the ground. The gesture says something like, "This is done properly," or "Our hands are clean if you fix what you broke," or possibly, "Please don't pretend you didn't see this." It is an oddly practical kind of symbolism, less fireworks. More paperwork, except the paperwork is wood, and the pen is steel, and because it's practical, it comes with practical worries. Who saw me do this? Who might blame me for doing this? Who might decide later that I did it too loudly or too quietly, or too close to their field, or too far from the proper boundary? In small communities, almost anything can be remembered. A misplaced gesture can follow you like a burr stuck to wool. So the protection of the cursors is partly about limiting the noise, limiting the audience, and limiting the chances of misunderstanding. It's not that Vikings didn't enjoy a good boast. It's that boasts are expensive when you have to live next door to the person you just embarrassed. That's why the boundary matters so much. The Níðstöng is often imagined at an edge, a property line, a path, a ditch, a place where land switches from mine to not mine. Edges are useful because they are already agreed to be controversial in a controlled way. Everyone knows where to argue. Everyone knows where not to argue. The pole belongs in the argument zone. If you put it too close to a house, it becomes a direct attack. Too far away, and it becomes a rumor with poor reception. The boundary is the sleepy compromise, close enough to be clear, far enough to pretend you're still civilized, and the wind does the rest. With the stubborn devotion of a coworker who never misses a shift, the wind carries words. It carries smell. It carries the faint logic of this is not private. The person raising the Níðstöng may speak softly on purpose, letting the air be the messenger, because the air is always available to testify and never asks to be paid. There's also a quiet irony in that the curse is meant to call down judgment, but the method is basically an early form of public posting. In modern terms, it's like pinning a complaint to a community bulletin board, except the board is a horse head on a pole, and the moderator is fear of retaliation. Retaliation is the constant background hum here, not as a dramatic threat, but as a simple reality. If you accuse someone publicly of wrongdoing, they may deny it. They may mock you. They may do what humans have always done when they feel cornered. They may look for a way to turn the embarrassment into your problem. So the person making the curse wants to keep the curse about the issue, not about me. This is why witnesses matter and why the wording can be brief, repetitive, and standardized. A standardized curse is harder to interpret as a personal insult. It's like using a template. Templates are boring. Boring is safe. Boring is, in its own way, protective, asterisk. Sometimes the protection is physical and domestic, which is where things get almost comically mundane. You can imagine someone returning home after raising a Níðstöng and then doing the quiet tasks of not attracting bad luck, bad gossip, or bad consequences. Doors are checked, animals are settled, tools are put back where they belong, and in some accounts and folk practices, ash appears a pinch of it, smeared lightly, not as decoration, but as a sign. Ash is what remains after the heat, after the noise, after the bright moment. It is calm residue. To mark a door with ash is to place a small reminder on the threshold, a suggestion to whatever forces are listening that the household is not asking for extra attention. If the curse needs an answer, let the answer go to the pole, out there, in the boundary space where arguments are supposed to happen, not here, in the warm room where people are trying to sleep. Ash is also wonderfully cheap. Nobody needs to import it. Nobody needs to trade for it. It is the opposite of luxury. It is what you have after the expensive part, after the wood has been burned, after the meal has been cooked, after the lamp has done its work. In that sense, it suits the whole mood of these rituals. A community using what is available. A public warning made out of wood, breath, and leftover gray dust. It's the kind of spirituality that keeps its receipts small. Even the timing can be deliberately unromantic. Night work sounds dramatic until you remember what night work often looks like. Tired people, quiet steps, a lantern that makes everything appear slightly uncertain. Night also has practical advantages. Fewer eyes, fewer questions, Less chance of someone starting a lively argument at the exact moment you were trying to deliver a carefully controlled message. The curse is public, but the act of setting it up can be discreet. There's a calm efficiency to it. You do the thing, you finish, you leave. You don't linger to admire your own handiwork like an artist. You treat it as a task, the way you treat stacking firewood or fixing a fence. Boundary is routine, not spectacle. That routine extends to who is allowed to be involved. Children, in many communities, are kept inside, not because children are fragile creatures made of glass, but because children talk. They talk the way breathing happens. They repeat what they hear. They add details. They simplify details. They accidentally turn a careful legal social warning into a bedtime story that begins with, "Guess what happened near the ditch?" So you keep children away, not out of cruelty, but out of basic information security. It is the medieval version of lowering your voice when you discuss something you don quoted tomorrow. Animals, too, might be tied short for the night. Not because the cow has an opinion on legal procedure, but because animals wander, and wandering animals create chaos. A goat can become an uninvited participant in any human plan, and goats in particular have the energy of someone who thinks rules are suggestions. So there is a whole small world of precaution. Latch the gate, tie the rope, keep the dog from barking at the wrong moment, keep the horse from walking too close to the pole and turning the scene into something awkwardly symbolic. The more you look at it, the more you see that protecting the cursors is really about protecting the community from spiraling conflict. A Níðstöng is already a sign that the normal methods, talking, mediating, paying compensation, have stalled or failed. So everyone involved wants to prevent the situation from turning into a fever. They want it to remain a cold thing, a structured thing. Cold is easier to store. Cold is easier to measure. Cold is, in a strange way, more polite. The words are spoken. The witness hears them. The pole stands. The wrongdoer is warned. And then everyone tries to go back to the deeply important work of living. Eating, mending, sleeping, fetching water, pretending they weren't involved. There's also an interesting, sleepy tension between the magical and the legal here. The horse head looks like a supernatural threat, but the surrounding behavior looks like procedure. You name the act. You name the person. You place the object at a boundary. You involve a witness. You keep the wording consistent. You avoid unnecessary flourish. It resembles a court action more than a curse, and that may be the point. Even when you invoke gods or spirits in the phrasing, you're still building a case in the only courtroom that is always open, public opinion. The pole is evidence. The gesture with the knife is a signature. The ash is a preventative measure. The wind is the messenger. And the next day, when someone walks past and sees it, the community has something to talk about that is not gossip exactly, but not gossip either. Because gossip and law are cousins who keep borrowing each other's clothes. A rumor becomes a complaint. A complaint becomes a dossier. A dossier becomes a verdict. A verdict becomes a story. In a place where institutions are limited and travel is slow, story is infrastructure. The Níðstöng plugs into that. It creates a story with an address, this boundary, this direction, this name. And it does it without needing a judge to clear his throat. It's also worth noticing how often the ritual tries to be tidy. Tidy is calming. Tidy is metabolically economical. The words are measured. The placement is deliberate. Even the posture matters, standing straight, speaking steadily, not performing. You pace your breath, in 4, out 6. The goal is clarity, not excitement. Excitement invites mistakes. Mistakes invite consequences. And consequences in a small settlement can last longer than you want them to. So the curse is delivered like someone reading a recipe they've made many times. Calm, repetitive, reassuringly dull, except the recipe is for public shame and the ingredients are social pressure. If you listen closely, you can also hear the quiet fear of misdirection. It matters which way the horse head faces. It matters whose land it looks toward. You want the message to be unambiguous. A misaimed horse head is like sending a letter to the wrong house and then being surprised the wrong person is upset. There is a softness to that image, a community waking up to find the pole pointed at the wrong farm, and then spending a whole day politely pretending not to notice while everyone privately notices. You can almost feel the tired embarrassment in the air. Nobody wants to be the person who says, "I think your curse is aimed at my milking shed." Even that sentence is exhausting, so protection includes accuracy. It includes making sure the right person is warned, because warning the wrong person is how you create an additional problem for free. And free problems are never truly free. They are paid for later with awkward conversations and strained alliances and the slow corrosion of trust. Now, as the night settles after the pool is raised, the community returns to its small noises. A latch clicks, a bowl is set down. A dog sighs and curls into itself. Somewhere, someone's lamp gutters and steadies. The Níðstöng stands outside in the cold air, doing its silent work. It does not chase anyone. It does not shout. It simply exists like a very stern signpost. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling and the most boring part of it. The warning is passive. The warning waits. It waits the way stone waits. It waits the way an unpaid debt waits quietly in the corner of the mind. In the morning, people will pass by and look without looking. They will read without admitting they've read. They will adjust their stories to include the new fact, like adding a small note to a ledger. And the person who raised it will try to behave normally because normalcy is a form of armor. If you act calm, the world sometimes agrees to stay calm with you. If you act frantic, the world becomes interested, and interest is expensive. So keep facts in one jar: name, act, witness, direction, the small ritual touches that make a public message feel proper. Keep anxiety in another jar smaller, tight, and allowed to cool by the fire until it becomes manageable. The night does not need to become a spectacle. It only needs to become a routine that holds the boundary in place for a little while longer, until the next step arrives gently, whether it is apology settlement or the quiet fading of the poles, meaning as weather and time do their patient work. You might not expect a kingdom to run on pieces of wood that look like badly behaved ruler marks, but for a long time it did. Not on shining coins, not on dramatic declarations, but on vaddish little sticks of hazel or willow or some other politely ordinary tree cut to length, notched, with quiet certainty and then split in two like a secret shared between two pockets. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air be soft. Let whatever light you have be a gentle one. And if you're listening from somewhere specific, somewhere with a blanket, or a bus seat, or a desk you've promised you'll leave soon, just notice the time, the way you'd notice the slow drip of a tap. You don't need to tell anyone. It's enough that you know. In a few minutes, we'll be talking about medieval and early modern English tally sticks, which are, in spirit, the least glamorous receipts ever invented. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where someone decides that the best way to dispose of centuries of wooden receipts is to set them on fire indoors, you can subscribe. Or don't. Either way, the tally sticks will continue being wooden, and the bureaucracy will continue being oddly confident that wood remembers better than humans can. So imagine you're in a room that smells faintly of damp wool, ink that never fully dries, and the kind of smoke that comes from a hearth that has seen too many winters. Someone hands you a stick. It is not a magic stick. It is not carved with dragons. It is not even trying to be impressive. It is simply a piece of wood, trimmed straight enough that it won't snag too much on cloth, and long enough that it can be held without losing your temper. On the stick, a clerk begins to cut notches. Not pretty notches, not decorative notches. These notches are functional like a spoon. A big notch might mean a big unit. Smaller notches might mean smaller units. The system varies over time, but the overall attitude stays the same. Numbers should be visible, tactile, and slightly annoying to fake. There's something deeply sleepy about the choice of materials. Wood is quiet. Wood does not sparkle. Wood does not argue with you. Wood takes a mark and keeps it. And because this is a world where paper can be expensive, and ink can run, and literacy is not evenly distributed like rainfall, a notchstick becomes a kind of stubborn little truth. It's the kind of truth you can put in a pouch, you can drop it. You can pick it up again. It doesn't mind. It's basically a receipt designed by someone who has watched too many documents dissolve into dampness and decided to give up on elegance. The cutting itself is almost meditative. A knife presses into grain. The sound is small. A little scrape. A little bite. One notch. Another notch. The clerk's hand is practiced enough to look bored, which is always how you know a system is established. The clerk is not performing genius. The clerk is performing routine. And routine is a warm blanket for the human mind, because routine says, this has happened before, and it will happen again, and nobody is surprised. The most exciting thing in this moment might be the fact that the knife is sharp, which is, honestly, a kind of excitement that fades quickly once you've decided you like having fingers. And then comes the oddly intimate part. The stick is split lengthwise, so that each half carries the same pattern of notches. One half is called the stock, the other is called the foil. It is like taking a sentence and tearing it in half in a way that guarantees the two pieces can still be matched later. When you split a stick, the wood does something paper cannot do. It creates a jagged, unique seam. It's a homemade fingerprint. You can try to fake notches, but faking the exact split of a particular piece of wood is a much fussier hobby. The clerk might not describe it in romantic terms, but the logic is solid and pleasantly simple. If the two halves fit together, the record is likely genuine. If they don't, someone is being optimistic. Now your mind might wander to modern receipts, emails, PDFs, little numbers that float in the cloud like polite ghosts. But a tally stick is not floating anywhere. It is sitting in someone's hand. It has weight. It has splinters if you're unlucky. It has that faint smell of fresh cut wood that makes your brain think of carpentry, even if you have never once built anything you trust to hold a shelf. And the humor, if you let it arrive quietly, is that this is financial technology. This is an accounting system that can be chewed by a dog and still be recognizable afterward, which is perhaps the most practical cybersecurity measure ever devised. Once the two halves exist, they go their separate, boring ways. One half stays with the authority, often the exchequer or the relevant office. The other goes with the person who paid, or promised to pay, or is being politely encouraged to pay. The stick becomes a relationship, not a romantic one, not an emotional one, but a relationship nonetheless. Two parties, one obligation, and a shared piece of wood that says, we both agree this happened, in the same tone a lock says, we both agree this door is closed. And then, because history loves to be quietly complicated, you start to see these sticks piling up. Imagine a treasury that doesn't just have money in it, but also has shelves, literal shelves, stacked with old wooden claims. Some are short. Some are long. Some are darkened with age. Some are still pale. They sit like a forest of paperwork that has been cut down and reorganized into evidence. Clerks handle them and rehandle them. They count them. They check them. They sigh over them. If you've ever scrolled through old confirmation emails looking for one specific message, you already understand the emotional tone, except the emails are sticks and the inbox is a room of dust. In some periods, tally sticks became so normal that they were used across multiple kinds of payments and accounting. Taxes, loans, wages, all sorts of things that sound dull, until you remember that dull is often what keeps the roof from collapsing. There's a micro absurdity here, the kind that makes you smile without waking yourself up. You can have a kingdom that does grand things wars, cathedrals, royal weddings, and yet the daily proof that money moved from one place to another is a notched twig. The majesty sits on top. The twig does the lifting. You might not expect a kingdom to run on pieces of wood that look like badly behaved ruler marks, but for a long time it did. Not on shining coins, not on dramatic declarations, but on faddish little sticks of hazel or willow or some other politely ordinary tree cut to length, notched, with quiet certainty and then split in two like a secret shared between two pockets. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air be soft. Let whatever light you have be a gentle one. And if you're listening from somewhere specific, somewhere with a blanket, or a bus seat, or a desk you've promised you'll leave soon, just notice the time, the way you'd notice the slow drip of a tap. You don't need to tell anyone. It's enough that you know. In a few minutes, we'll be talking about medieval and early modern English tally sticks, which are, in spirit, the least glamorous receipts ever invented. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where someone decides that the best way to dispose of centuries of wooden receipts is to set them on fire indoors, you can subscribe. Or don't. Either way, the tally sticks will continue being wooden, and the bureaucracy will continue being oddly confident that wood can remembers better than humans can. So imagine you're in a room that smells faintly of damp wool, ink that never fully dries, and the kind of smoke that comes from a hearth that has seen too many winters. Someone hands you a stick. It is not a magic stick. It is not carved with dragons. It is not even trying to be impressive. It is simply a piece of wood, trimmed straight enough that it won't snag too much on cloth, and long enough that it can be held without losing your temper. On the stick, a clerk begins to cut notches. Not pretty notches, not decorative notches. These notches are functional like a spoon. A big notch might mean a big unit. Smaller notches might mean smaller units. The system varies over time, but the overall attitude stays the same. Numbers should be visible, tactile, and slightly annoying to fake. There's something deeply sleepy about the choice of materials. Wood is quiet. Wood does not sparkle. Wood does not argue with you. Wood takes a mark and keeps it. And because this is a world where paper can be expensive, and ink can run, and literacy is not evenly distributed like rainfall, a notch stick becomes a kind of stubborn little truth. It's the kind of truth you can put in a pouch, you can drop it. You can pick it up again. It doesn't mind. It's basically a receipt designed by someone who has watched too many documents dissolve into dampness and decided to give up on elegance. The cutting itself is almost meditative. A knife presses into grain. The sound is small. A little scrape. A little bite. One notch. Another notch. The clerk's hand is practiced enough to look bored, which is always how you know a system is established. The clerk is not performing genius. The clerk is performing routine. And routine is a warm blanket for the human mind, because routine says, this has happened before, and it will happen again. And nobody is surprised. The most exciting thing in this moment might be the fact that the knife is sharp, which is, honestly, a kind of excitement that fades quickly once you've decided you like having fingers. And then comes the oddly intimate part. The stick is split lengthwise, so that each half carries the same pattern of notches. One half is called the stock. The other is called the foil. It is like taking a sentence and tearing it in half in a way that guarantees the two pieces can still be matched later. When you split a stick, the wood does something paper cannot do. It creates a jagged, unique seam. It's a homemade fingerprint. You can try to fake notches, but faking the exact split of a particular piece of wood is a much fussier hobby. The clerk might not describe it in romantic terms, but the logic is solid and pleasantly simple. If the two halves fit together, the record is likely genuine. If they don't, someone is being optimistic. Now your mind might wander to modern receipts, emails, PDFs, little numbers that float in the cloud like polite ghosts. But a tally stick is not floating anywhere. It is sitting in someone's hand. It has weight. It has splinters if you're unlucky. It has that faint smell of fresh cut wood that makes your brain think of carpentry, even if you have never once built anything you trust to hold a shelf. And the humor, if you let it arrive quietly, is that this is financial technology. This is an accounting system that can be chewed by a dog and still be recognizable afterward, which is perhaps the most practical cybersecurity measure ever devised. Once the two halves exist, they go their separate, boring ways. One half stays with the authority, often the exchequer or the relevant office. The other goes with the person who paid, or promised to pay, or is being politely encouraged to pay. The stick becomes a relationship. Not a romantic one, not an emotional one, but a relationship nonetheless. Two parties, one obligation, and a shared piece of wood that says, "We both agree this happened," in the same tone a lock says, "We both agree this door is closed." And then, because history loves to be quietly complicated, you start to see these sticks piling up. Imagine a treasury that doesn't just have money in it, but also has shelves, literal shelves, stacked with old wooden claims. Some are short. Some are long. Some are darkened with age. Some are still pale. They sit like a forest of paperwork that has been cut down and reorganized into evidence. Clerks handle them and rehandle them. They count them. They check them. They sigh over them. If you've ever scrolled through old confirmation emails looking for one specific message, you already understand the emotional tone, except the emails are sticks and the inbox is a room with dust. In some periods, tally sticks became so normal that they were used across multiple kinds of payments and accounting. Taxes, loans, wages, all sorts of things that sound dull, until you remember that dull is often what keeps the roof from collapsing. There's a micro absurdity here, the kind that makes you smile without waking yourself up. You can have a kingdom that does grand things, wars, cathedrals, royal weddings, and yet the daily proof that money moved from one place to another is a notched twig. The majesty sits on top. The twig does the lifting. You might not expect the end of a Viking curse to look like tidy community maintenance, but it often does. Not with lightning, not with a dramatic soundtrack, but with rope that loosens in rain, with wood that dries in creeks, with a valley that pretends it was never watching in the first place. If your space is quiet, let it stay that way. Let the air be a little cooler at the edges and warmer where your blanket touches you. Somewhere very far from you, imagine a pole standing in soil that has seen many ordinary footsteps and thought nothing of them. And softly, before we wander any deeper into this, just a small whisper of a question, because questions are gentle things when you don't have to answer them out loud. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? You can keep it to yourself. It's enough that your mind notices it, the way it notices a slow drip, or a distant train, or the quiet weight of your own breathing. If you happen to still be awake by the time we reach the part where a community treats an insult like official paperwork, you can subscribe. Or don't, it's fine. The wind won't judge you, and neither will a piece of wood with a message tied to it. The world has always been full of warnings that nobody reads properly until it's too late. And subscriptions are at least a modern warning you can undo with a tap. So we're in the last stretch now, after the pool has been raised, after the words have been said, after the direction has been chosen with the seriousness of a compass. The night has done its quiet work. The witnesses have heard enough to say later that yes, it happened, and no, it wasn't a joke, and yes, the pole was definitely pointing that way. The next morning arrives in the old, unimpressed manner of mornings. There's light, there's dampness. There is a bird that has no idea it is living near a ritual. Someone wakes up with straw in their hair and immediately starts thinking about chores. And somewhere out there, the pole is still standing, and that is the point. It's not a performance that ends when the audience claps. It's an object that remains, a sentence that keeps existing in wood. The community's relationship with a Níðstöng is, strangely, both casual and intense. Casual because these are practical people, used to seeing tools and posts and fences and markers everywhere. Intense because this particular post is not marking a boundary for sheep. It's marking a boundary for reputation. And reputation, in a world where your name is your access to trade, marriage, protection, and a place at a feast, is not just an abstract concept. Reputation is a kind of currency that can't be minted again once it's bent. So when a shame pole stands, it stands like a rumor that learned how to hold still. People passing by might not stop and stare for long. They might, in fact, try not to stare, which is a very human reaction to anything that feels socially dangerous. But they will glance. They will register the direction. They will register the fact that someone felt pushed far enough to do this. They will carry the knowledge the way you carry a small stone in your pocket without meaning to. This is how the pole works, in the least magical sense. Not by summoning invisible forces, but by turning a dispute into a public object that refuses to be ignored. It is the difference between someone texting you an insult and someone putting it on a sign in the middle of town. The words are the same, but the air around them changes. And because the air changes, behavior changes. The target of the pole, whether it's a person, a household, a leader, may suddenly find that conversations become shorter, invitations become rarer. Negotiations become strangely stiff, like leather left too long and cold. People who used to greet them with easy familiarity might start greeting them with that polite, careful distance that signals, I'm not taking sides, but I'm also not taking risks. It's almost funny, in a dry way, how quickly a community can become a committee. Nobody wants to be the one who casually sides with the cursed party, not if the whole valley is currently pretending it has a unified moral nervous system. So what counts as a sign that it worked? In the calm, slow logic of everyday life, worked often means produced movement. It might mean the target approaches with a mediator, or sends a message, or offers some kind of settlement. It might mean they provide surety, someone willing to stand behind a promise, a person whose presence says, this will be handled. Surety is such a soothing concept, really. It's the idea that even if trust is thin, you can stack enough witnesses and obligations on top of it until it holds. In some legal and social contexts, that's how peace is made. Not with deep emotional resolution, but with enough practical scaffolding to keep everyone from falling into feud. Sometimes the sign is less direct. Sometimes it's silence that feels intentional. Sometimes it's a sudden willingness to talk at the next assembly where previously there was avoidance. Sometimes it's a quick apology that is not dramatic, not poetic, but strategically timed, like a door closing before a draft gets worse. A Níðstöng doesn't have to end in anyone crying in the rain. It can end in people simply doing the thing they were supposed to do earlier, except now they do it because the pole is standing there, pointing quietly, insisting that the argument has left the private realm and started wearing public shoes. And if movement happens, the pole can be taken down. That moment, too, is revealing because it is, again, practical. The head may be removed and buried or disposed of in a way that signals closure and containment, facing away, tucked down, made less visible. The pole might be pulled from the earth with a few steady tugs, the kind of tugging that makes you feel how heavy damp soil is when it doesn't want to let go. The rope might be untied. The knots might be stubborn. Knots always hold on to their purpose a little longer than the people who tied them. The message might be cut loose and, depending on the mood, stored as evidence or destroyed as a ritual ending, or simply lost to the casual chaos of objects that no longer feel urgent. It's tempting to imagine this as dramatic, but it's better, sleepier, to imagine it as a quiet dismantling. A thing was done, a point was made, Then the thing is undone because the whole purpose was to push the world back into a livable shape. A feud is loud and expensive. A settlement is, by comparison, like putting tools back on a shelf. Not thrilling, but deeply satisfying. And if no movement happens, then the pole becomes a standing problem. It remains. It gathers weather. Rain turns wood darker. Frost makes it brittle. Wind adds its own commentary by shaking whatever has been tied to it. Over time, the pole might look less like a fresh accusation and more like an old complaint that refuses to fully disappear. That can be part of its strength. Old complaints have a particular power. They feel established. They feel like they've earned their place in the landscape, like the grumpy stone in the corner of a field that has been inconvenient for generations and is now treated as if it has legal rights. But nature also does what nature does, which is to dilute human intentions with time. Ropes loosen, wet fibers stretch, wood shrinks and swells. Ravens and other curious creatures might interfere, not out of malice, but out of the simple desire to tug at interesting objects. If the message was tied with a strip of cloth, the cloth will fray. If it was carved, the carving will soften at the edges. The pole becomes less readable, and that too has meaning. A warning that can no longer be read becomes more like a mood than a message. And sometimes people deliberately interfere in the other direction. A counter curse or a counter gesture or demand from elders that the matter be brought into open discussion. This is where the calm logic of a community asserts itself again. Even a society comfortable with symbolic acts still lives under the constant pressure of maintaining peace, trade, and daily function. There is always a line, and that line is usually drawn by people who are tired, older, or both. The elders, or the assembly, or whoever holds the authority in that place will eventually say, in some form, enough. We will speak about this in daylight. Daylight is the enemy of lingering symbolic tension. Daylight insists on specifics. That's one of the quiet themes here, the difference between night language and day language. Night language can hold ambiguity. Night language can be poetic, pointed, and satisfied with suggestion. Day language wants names, dates, witnesses, remedies. Night language raises a pole. Day language asks who is paying for the damage and how soon. Both are part of social technology. The Níðstöng belongs to the night side of the system public, yes, but also deeply atmospheric. It uses wind, direction, and the sense that the land itself is watching. Then the community, when it's ready, drags the whole thing back into daylight, where everything becomes slightly less romantic and slightly more contractual. There's also a small, sleepy irony in how carefully a Níðstöng can be framed as not violence. It is a threat in the sense that it escalates social pressure, but it is also compared to outright feud, a kind of pressure valve. It says, I am angry and I am making it known, but I am still operating within some recognizable boundary. It's a warning that gives the other party time to respond. It's a forced conversation starter, like leaving a very stern note on someone's door, except the note is attached to a pole and the entire valley is CCD. And because it is a boundary act, it often comes with boundary-minded details that feel almost soothing in their specificity. The requirement of witnesses so the act can't be dismissed as a private tantrum. The careful wording kept short because too many words weaken the edge. The direction chosen for a reason, so the insult has a target and doesn't just wander around like a bored mosquito. Even the idea that the act should be performed without boasting, without extra theatrics, because once it becomes theater, it becomes entertainment, and entertainment is too slippery to serve as proof. This is, in a way, a culture trying to keep its own anger tidy. Not gentle, exactly, but tidy. Now, as we drift toward the soft closing of this whole topic, it helps to treat the bedtime oath part as the most practical lesson hidden inside a very strange custom. A Níðstöng is, among other things, a reminder that words can be heavy enough to require procedure. That's almost comforting, isn't it? The idea that speech has weight, that it isn't just sound, that it's treated as something you can be held to. In modern life, words can fly around so quickly that they feel weightless, like sparks. But here we have a society saying if you speak hard words, you need witnesses. You need a method. You need to be able to justify it in daylight. So imagine, gently, a small oath you take not to become your sharpest self when you're tired. Not because you must be perfect, but because tiredness makes everybody dramatic in unhelpful ways. Keep facts in one jar, the name, the act, the remedy. Keep anger in another jar, small, tied tight, cooled by morning air. If you must speak, speak what you can prove when the sun is up and your breath is steadier. Let the wind carry away the extra words, the ones that feel satisfying in the moment but expensive later. And if peace is offered, take it in steps you can walk back without shame. That's the quiet genius of settlements. They don't require you to feel transformed. They just require you to move in a safer direction. A notch at a time, a promise with surety, a boundary respected. You don't have to love your enemy. You just have to stop spending your life feeding the fire. Somewhere in that old valley, the horse grows quiet because it was never truly the point. The pole stands watch because standing is what poles do, and the wind does what wind does, and the community does what communities always do. It tries to survive itself. The message, once urgent, becomes part of the landscape for a while, and then it fades into weather and memory, and the road forgets the story the way roads forget footsteps, one after another, until only the shape of the path remains. And even that softens at the edges, and you can let your mind soften too, and keep drifting and keep breathing in and out until the words become as light as frost on wood and as easy to leave behind.